Are you someone in a very small wood shop or someone that just likes using the table saw a lot for your woodworking projects? This video is for you. We're going to talk about 5 table saw jigs that will improve your workflow. Okay, so not all of these table saw jigs are going to be used on every project. In fact, many of the jigs are designed for specialty work, specialty cuts, specialty joinery, etc. But they are jigs that can help enhance your skills as a woodworker and make life easier. There are also jigs that will allow you to do things as if you had a specialty machine without spending the money on that specialty machine. The first jig is a circle cutting jig. And as you probably guessed, this jig is for cutting circles. It's a quite simple jig. You'll have a runner on the bottom that goes into the slot on your table saw, and then just a flat piece of material on top. I use plywood because it's stable and it's very flat. So you're going to cut this piece of wood to be flush to your table saw blade here. And then you're just going to drill in some holes going from the blade measurement, the blade side measurement over this way. And those holes are going to be the radius of whatever size circle you want to do. So for example, if you want a 8-inch wide circle, then you're going to cut a hole that is 4 inches measured from this side over this way. And then you're going to need a nail or something straight to fit through that hole. That's the entire jig, plain and simple. So I have a couple different holes here at different measurements. And then again, I have a nail that pokes and fits through that hole. That's all you need for the jig. Now let's talk about the material. Material setup is quite simple. All you want to do is find the center of the material that you're wanting to cut. So this I have about 8 5/8. So let's just call it, we'll do 4 1/4. That'll give us enough room to cut a 8-inch circle. And that's it. If the length mattered to you as well, then you would need to measure that. But in this case, I obviously have more than 8 inches this way. So I'm just gonna drill a hole at this point. And again, you're wanting to find the center. So the circle is going to be this around the point. And then I'm going to drill a hole here that is the same size as the nail that's on my jig. And then slide your material over top of the nail, and you're ready to begin. So the way this jig works is that you raise the blade up to be higher than your material and the jig combined, of course. And then you're going to slide the material through to shave off whatever's overhanging on the jig, rotate it, cut it, rotate it, and eventually it will create a circle. Let me show you. And now with a few cuts and a lot of a mess later, you now have a perfect circle. The downside to this is that you do have a hole in the middle. If that's an issue for your project, you could always laminate the top with a veneer or some sort of other piece. But now you have at least a template, and that could be something that you could use this jig for, is to create a template, and then you could put this template onto your final piece, use a flush trim bit to get a perfect circle where you don't have a hole drilled into your final piece. But it's a quick, simple jig. You can make it in a couple minutes, and you can cut out circles. Number 2 is a tapering jig or a joining jig. It can serve 2 purposes. The first thing is for edge joining pieces of wood. So while that line might look straight, if you eyeballed it on a bandsaw or a table saw, if you're rough milling lumber, it's not straight. I don't think it is. So what this jig can do is you can loosen this up, put your piece on here. It doesn't really matter where it goes as long as it overhangs this edge of the jig. So get it where it overhangs it. Again, it does not matter where exactly it goes. Tighten this piece down. And then these clamps are designed to hold down, but they do not reach to the material always. So I just created a little spacer here that will help clamp those down. Okay, so now that this is fully overhanging, we're going to raise the blade up to where it's above the height of the material and then make the cut. And now we know that that is a perfectly straight edge. So that's the joining portion of this jig. What it can also do is create tapers. So if you knew that you wanted 4-inch taper from the top to a 2-inch measurement at the bottom. I'm not going to measure it out, but you could measure, mark a line, measure, mark a line, and then you would just align your 2-inch mark down here, your 4-inch mark up here, and then you would move your piece here to where you want it to be. Again, so this would be marked at the 4-inch piece, and this would be marked at the 2-inch piece. And we would tighten this down, add our spacer in here, clamp it down, and make the cut. And so now we would have theoretically a 2-inch to a 4-inch taper. This comes in handy for making table legs, chair legs, anything really that you want to taper on. So again, this jig can serve two purposes, both for jointing and for, or at least edge jointing, as well as creating tapers and angles. And by the way, I did create a video on making that tapering jig, and I'll leave a link to it up here in the corner as well as down in the description. In fact, I've made a video on making several of these jigs, which again, you can find down in the description. Okay, number 3 is a crosscut jig or a crosscut sled. Again, you can make one yourself. This is an Incra. This is a miter sled or a crosscut sled made by Incra. And what this is really good for is getting very square, very accurate measurements for just cross-cutting material, basically cutting it against the grain. Typically, you use your table saw to cut it with the grain. That's called ripping material. This is designed to cut it against the grain and or perpendicular to the wood grain. And in my experience, this is a lot more accurate than using a miter saw. So what I typically do for projects is use a miter saw to rough cut lumber down to rough dimensions, maybe add a 1/2 inch to each end, get everything milled down and planed down to the correct thickness, and then I use this miter sled on the table saw to get it set to the exact length. And the exact width, of course, will be done using the table saw fence and ripping the material. But this one's pretty nice. Again, you don't have to buy one that's this expensive. You can make one yourself. I have a video of making one, which again, I will link up in the corner and down in the description. But this one, you know, you can square up the end, flip it around, put a stop block down on whatever measurement you like, and get it cut to that exact measurement. It also has the ability to cut certain angles, so you can loosen all these knobs up, turn this fence on the miter saw sled or the crosscut sled to get the exact angle of cut that you would like. So it is very versatile. I use this probably more than any other jig in my shop, just again for getting exact dimensions crosscut to length on the table saw, which in my experience is a lot more accurate than using a miter saw. Number 4 in my list is a tenoning jig. Again, you can buy these, but it's a lot cheaper to make one. I made this one to where the inside of this, the inside dimension of this is the exact outside dimension of my table saw fence, so that this can slide on here and fit perfectly. That means that this inside face is perfectly square to the bed of my table saw. And what this is designed is I have a stop block back here. I have a piece of white ash as an example. If you wanted to cut a tenon in this, you would put the piece against this stop block, and you could add clamps as needed, but you slide this over. You would adjust your blade height to whatever length of tenon that you wanted. Again, I'm not super accurate for the sake of the video, but let's say that's where I wanted my tenon to be, and then I'm going to adjust the fence to where I wanted that. And then once you fire up the table saw, you can cut your tenon through the blade, or run the tenoning jig through the blade with the material, and then just scoot your table saw over ever so slightly until you finish cutting the tenon. As long as this block and the face of this is square and correct when you make the jig, then the tenon should come out perfectly. So now after your tenon is cut, it might need a little cleanup just from the saw blade marks, but you now have a tenon cut that you can use either as half lap joinery. You can use a true mortise and tenon joint. There's multiple different tenon type of cuts that you can use with this tenoning jig. Number 5 on my list is a spline jig, and I do have a video on making this as well. But basically the way this works is I made it with an adjustable blocks that can move back and forth, and splines are really good for reinforcing mitered joints. I use it specifically on making wooden boxes. So these blocks can adjust and can fit the size of the box. Once they are securely holding your box in place, tighten the knobs down. But basically the blade will be wherever you want it to be. If you wanted the blade to be to one side of the box, you'd move the blocks over and hold the box in a different place. But for the sake of this, I'm going to use the same piece of ash as our sample box. Move these blocks in place. Make sure it's really squeezing our piece well. Lock those blades down, hold everything in place, and then make the cut. And I'm not going to do it because it's going to be hard to see on camera, but you would raise your blade height to where it's poking through the center of this jig. And the way this jig is at a 45-degree angle, it will leave a perfect spline cut, which is 45 degrees to the 45-degree cut through the bottom of your joint, and you can cut another piece of filler or the spline itself to be able to put in there. So another useful jig that you can make yourself for fairly cheap. So before I get absolutely crucified in the comments, I'm fully aware that there are other jigs. There's many other jigs that can be used with the table saw. These are just 5 that I find myself using the most often. There's dovetail jigs that you can make to use. There's a bunch of other ones, but these are just 5. If you have one that's super creative that not many people know of, or that maybe you even came up with yourself, leave a comment down below. I'd love to see it, talk about it, and maybe even make another video about it. So hope you found this helpful. Hope this has shown you ways that you can use your table saw for more than just making rip cuts. Find me on Instagram at Rocky River Woodworks and online at rockyriverwoodworks.com. Thank you for watching. Take care.